Hello and welcome back, everybody. In today's class, we're going to be talking about the topic of emotional development, and it's going to be our first topic in one of the final, actually the final, big section of areas that we're going to be covering throughout this semester. Now, emotional development is a part of what we call the socio-emotional processes of development category that we kind of have mentioned a couple times throughout this class. So in the beginning of the class, we started talking about biological processes, the physical changes that happen with the body and nervous system and everything that kind of goes along with it. Then we transitioned into cognitive development and talked about what's going on inside the mind and processing and all the things that we relate to that particular category. And in these final sections, we're going to now be talking about socio-emotional change and socio-emotional growth. And there's a lot of different areas within that particular topic that we can and will be talking about. Depending upon the semester that we're in, usually we get to talk about 4 different areas of socio-emotional growth. In the summer, unfortunately, we don't get to cover the topic of moral change and development, but we always get to, every single session, talk about emotional change, personality and identity change, and sexuality and gender change. And all these categories kind of fit under the socio-emotional processes because all of these things are a big part not only of kind of what's going on in our minds, but how we're interacting with the people around us. And in today's class, we're going to be focusing on the concept of emotional development, which is going to play a role in a lot of the other areas that we're going to be talking about throughout this semester in this section of socio-emotional change and growth. And to talk about the idea of emotions, which is a great starting point, we first have to set some groundwork as to what emotions are all about, where they're coming from, and how we can make sense of them. So, to start off with, what I'd like to do is give you guys a definition, a general definition of emotions. Now, if you look in the literature, there's actually a large cluster of different definitions that are out there for emotions. And what we want to do is just look for one that kind of gives us the epitome of what emotions are without being overly painful or overly information ridden. So what you see there on this slide is a definition for emotions that work pretty well, or a definition of emotion, that works pretty well for multiple situations. So if we call an emotion a psychophysiological state of mind resulting from an interaction between an individual and their internal or external environment, we're getting a lot of different components to it. So we recognize this notion that emotions have psychological factors, but we also recognize within this definition that there's a lot of physiological things related to emotions. So the body is changing, either the brain or chemistry within our system is altering as a result of the emotions that we're experiencing. And the idea here is that these emotions are a direct product of something that happens in our mind. Sometimes it can be a thought or kind of a conclusion, or it can be a direct product of the environment, how it's kind of playing out in front of us and the emotions that those particular things trigger. And that's a big thing that we see with this concept of emotions, is that the social interaction and the idea of people needing to be around or us needing to be in a social world is really a prominent theme in most emotional research, or a prominent idea that many people think is required for us to study this idea of emotions. And when we look closer at the definition of emotions, we can add some subtle nuances to it to get a better understanding of what we're talking about. One of the things that people often talk about when they discuss this idea of emotions is something called valiance. It's kind of a type of feeling that an emotion elicits, and it can be positive or negative. But there are a lot of different types of positive emotions that are out there, negative emotions that are out there. But when we're talking about the idea of valiance, we're just talking about is this kind of a good emotion or a bad emotion that's a result of something that's going on in the environment or something that's going on in our head. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that just talking about good and bad is all we need to get a sense of emotions. We also might want to talk about the amount of arousal that a specific emotion elicits. So we could have something like sadness, which doesn't produce a lot of arousal. In fact, it makes us usually much more sedentary when we feel sadness, where with anger, it produces a whole bunch of arousal. Both have negative valence to them, but obviously the arousal levels of those emotions are different. So when we're talking about this idea of emotions, not only do we kind of look for the textbook definition, but we talk about the variance, we talk about the arousal level, we talk about the specific type of emotion that we're looking at, and we operate on this assumption that these things are used to interact with our environment, and they're also used to kind of impact our cognitions and our body, how we interact with people, often as a byproduct of the emotions that we experience. When we talk more about where emotions are coming from, how we can recognize these through a really scientific lens, one of the things that we've discovered over the years is that emotions aren't just things that we kind of think we feel. In fact, people nowadays, when studying the idea of emotions, oftentimes relates to or use specific measurement devices that can look at things like how much somebody is perspiring, how much their eyes are kind of dilating. But we can also look for things going on within the brain and the physiological system, because we now know nowadays, sorry, it sounded a little weird, that we have a number of systems within our body that actually relate to this experience of emotions. One of the biggest areas that are involved in emotion regulation and kind of the experience of emotions is an area of our brain which is a part of an area called the limbic system, called the amygdala. And the amygdala is actually a small, tiny structure in the brain that we know is highly inactive when we're experiencing different types of emotions. And we've known through different types of stimulation studies that if you stimulate the amygdala, you can actually get a really strong emotional response within an individual. We also know that the hippocampus, an area that's primarily associated with memory, does play a minor role in the experience of emotions. Usually it's the memories that are triggered that kind of produce different levels of emotions, with interacting with the amygdala, both being a part of this thing called the limbic system. And the other brain region that we know is strongly linked to emotions is an area of our brain that actually develops much later in life called the frontal lobe. I believe we talked about this earlier when we discussed the idea of kind of our neuroanatomy and how it develops. So the frontal lobe is not only important for higher order thinking, but it's very, very critical in our ability to delay gratification, to kind of control our emotions, to be able to really kind of elicit correct emotions and correct emotional responses based on the social situation that's around us. So when we look at somebody's emotions, we know the social factor is important. We know kind of the cognitions that somebody has is important. We also know that the body, in particular the brain, plays a major role. Now nowadays we also know, though, that it's more than just the brain. We've actually detected different nerves, in particular clusters of neurons that go to different regions of our brains that are very, very active when we're interacting with our environment through emotions. One of the newest things that we found, which is really interesting, is something called the vagus nerve, a cluster of neurons that actually extend from the lower region of the brain to some of our regulatory systems. And we now know that people who have high amounts of vagus nerve activity actually can usually control their emotions very well and are very attuned to the emotions that others have. We're going to talk a little bit later about this topic of something called EQ, or emotional intelligence. And we know that there's a direct link between vagus nerve activity and that particular ability. And there is one last area that we strongly link to emotions, in particular very, very strong emotions that we have that we need for kind of survival, and that's what's called the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Now, our sympathetic system deals with the ability to kind of resist dangerous things, the fight or flight system, while the parasympathetic system is what we have to kind of calm our body down. So when we experience something within our environment, our social world will trigger an emotional response, which will have a huge impact on the nerves that are kind of used to either run from something or to calm us down and allow us to kind of enjoy the situation. So when we talk about the idea of emotions, we assume that it's kind of a cognitive thing. We relate it to the social world, but one of the neat things that we've started to discover is that there's a lot of physiological things going on within a person when they're experiencing the emotions that they're experiencing. Now, one thing that's worth noting when we talk about this idea of emotions is that we haven't just linked the body to emotions. One of the new, very interesting areas that people have started linking to emotions is the area of culture. In particular, what we've seen is that even though we assume that emotions are kind of a universal thing, that everybody experiences the exact same types of emotions and that there's no individual differences that we see, When we look at different cultures, we actually see dramatic differences from culture to culture with respect to the types of emotions that people are exhibiting and the way that they exhibit the different types of emotions that are out there. In some cultures, usually we're looking at primarily East Asian cultures, many people are encouraged to strongly regulate their outward display of emotions. And in fact, there's some evidence to show that because they're regulating these outward displays of emotions, in particular extremely strong positive emotions, these individuals tend to at least report feeling less strong emotions than people from a Western culture or cultures that we're more accustomed to. Now, there are some other cultures, though, that actually do display something very different than that. There's some cultures where emotions are strongly encouraged and they're embraced. And within those kind of subcultures of big groups, we see people experiencing kind of a much wider range of emotions, much more specific types of emotions. And when they experience them, they usually experience them in a much more profound way, so much stronger kind of experience of emotions. Now, we also know there's individual differences that are there, but the fact that we can recognize dramatic shifts in emotion regulation, in emotion responses, and really the rules that a culture creates for what's an appropriate emotion and what's not, really tells us that not only is our body dictating the emotions that we're experiencing, but some of the things that we're growing up in can play a role in the emotions that we display and the way that we regulate the emotions that we're experiencing. However, when we look at this idea of culture, there's another really interesting fact about using culture with emotions. And it was actually one of the first ways that we discovered clear-cut evidence that emotions made sense, or the emotions were universal. And this was in a study that was conducted about 50 years ago from a man named Louis Goldberg. Now, this study that Goldberg ran was one of the first studies to try to detect whether or not we could find universal emotions from culture to culture. So even though we knew that some cultures displayed more emotions than others, some cultures had different ways of kind of communicating emotions or reacting to things, there was a belief by many emotional researchers that there might be specific emotions that were kind of universal across all cultures, that they were the basic emotions that everybody was kind of preordained to experience. Even if they maybe didn't want to express it due to their culture that they were growing up in, there was kind of this inkling to actually have some type of an emotion that was kind of found within every single culture. One of the first people to ever propose this idea, somebody you might have heard of before, his name was Charles Darwin, and he proposed in one of his evolutionary theories and his discussions that, since emotions were such a prominent part of the human experience, so they were so critical in our interactions, that we might have a couple emotions, he called them discrete emotions, that were not only found within everybody within a single culture, but found from culture to culture. And not only were they found everywhere, but they had specific signatures to them that we should be able to see. One of the signatures was that they should emerge very early in young children without them having to learn anything, and that there should be some physical, usually biological signature to them that was universal from person to person. And one of the people to test this theory that Darwin proposed was a man named Louis Goldberg, who decided to go from culture to culture doing something fairly unique. What he would do is he would recruit people who could speak the languages of many different cultures, and he would create these scenarios, these stories that he would tell people. So he would say something like, you own this piece of property, or you own this animal, and somebody comes, your neighbor comes, and steals that piece of property or steals that animal. How would you feel? And he asked them not to express in words what they would feel, but express in something very simple, a facial expression about what they would feel. And what Goldberg found was really, really game changing, because no matter which culture he was going to, many of his stories listed the exact same physical response, the same facial reflection. And Goldberg came to find that out of his many, many stories that he was presenting, there were about 6 universal facial features that were being displayed. Now, there were 2 other ones that kind of popped up along the years, but the 6 ones that Goldberg found were believed by him and many emotional researchers to be things that are really inherent within the individual. And we'll talk about earlier ones that kind of really take over. But what Goldberg argued was the 6 main ones that were out there were happiness, surprise, fear, sadness, disgust, and the last one, which you might see, is anger. And all of these are kind of pictured below. So anger would be I believe, E. Disgust would be F. Sadness would be D. Surprise would be B. Happiness A. And fear would be C. And he said that when he asked people to explain facial expressions that related to things that were, say, fear, like almost everybody across every culture displayed the same face that they saw and see. And he found kind of the markers within the face that he thought were really key pieces of evidence to show that maybe we didn't experience all the exact same emotions or have words for every single emotion that everybody in every culture experienced, but there were some basic emotions that were universal across all individuals and were there for purposes of survival, were essential for us to be able to convey something basic from one person to the next. And maybe hand gestures, body gestures might not be universal, but at least we had something that everybody could display, and that was some facial expression to show the emotions that we were feeling. And one of the questions you might be asking now is, okay, now that we've displayed an understanding of what emotions are all about, we've linked it to biology, we've linked it to the social world, we've linked it to culture. When we talk about emotions in development, what is actually developing? And this is a question that many people in the field of socio-emotional development have asked. And what they argue is there's actually a lot of different things that have to develop for us to really be developed in our emotional capabilities. One of the first things that we need to develop is a wider range of emotional expressions. So ways to kind of convey different types of emotions that we're experiencing, maybe even the ability to kind of display and experience other types of emotions might be something that has to come up. And then as we're displaying more emotions, as we're being more and more capable of experiencing a wider range of emotional experiences, another thing that we need to start to develop is the ability to recognize emotions, not only within ourselves, the ones that we're feeling due to the situation, but also the emotions of others. So if somebody's in this context or in this situation, what they would feel is something we have to develop. And more importantly, if somebody's displaying this face or this reaction to the environment, what emotion are they experiencing is something that many developmental psychologists think we have to learn and kind of develop an ability to do as we progress throughout our life. Another thing that's very important as we develop emotions is not only being able to experience them, but being able to control them, to kind of regulate some of the emotion-related behaviors that we have, or kind of dictate which emotions we're going to feel from moment to moment. And that involves not only recognizing kind of your own emotions, learning which types of behaviors that you can do to kind of regulate your emotions, but also having a keen sense of how your emotions, your emotional reactions, might impact the social world. Not only your own world, but the world of others around you. And to develop all of these skills and these sets of understanding, it takes a lot of time. And what we're going to do here in the next couple slides is really break down how this emotional growth actually happens from infancy all the way into our adulthood.